Leather was everywhere in the medieval world. It was the plastic of its day. People wore it, fought in it, carried things in it, and even drank from it. But leather doesn't just appear. It starts as something wet, bloody, and prone to rot. It starts as an animal's skin. The journey from a living creature to a durable pair of shoes was a long, smelly, and difficult one. It was the work of the tanner. The process began at the source of the hide. This was usually a butcher's shop in a town, a farm after a slaughter, or even a hunt. The animal, whether it was a cow, an ox, a sheep, a goat, or a deer, was skinned. This first step was crucial. A skilled skinner or flayer could remove the hide in one piece with few accidental cuts or holes. A poorly flayed hide, full of nicks and gashes, was worth much less. The goal was to get a clean, whole sheet of skin. The best leather came from cattle, strong and thick, perfect for soles of shoes, belts, and armor. Sheep and goat skins were thinner, softer, and better for gloves, bookbindings, or the uppers of shoes. Once the hide was off the animal, the clock started ticking. A fresh, raw hide is mostly water, protein, and fat. It's an ideal home for bacteria. Left to itself, it would begin to putrefy and rot within hours, especially in warm weather. The hair would slip out, the skin would break down, and it would become useless. The tanner had to stop this decay immediately. There were two common ways to do this. The first and most common method was salting. The fresh hide would be laid out, flesh side up, and covered in a thick layer of salt. Salt is a powerful preservative. It draws the water out of the skin, killing the bacteria that need moisture to survive. Several hides could be stacked on top of each other, each one layered with salt. This created a heavy, wet pile of salted skins called a pack. These hides could then be stored for weeks or months, waiting for the tanner to be ready for them. They could also be transported over long distances without rotting, allowing a tanner in a city to process hides from the countryside. The second method was drying. The hide was stretched out on a frame or hung over a pole and left to dry in the air. As the water evaporated, the skin became stiff and hard, like a board. This also stopped bacterial growth. Dried hides were lighter than salted ones, which made them easier to transport. The downside was that they were harder to rehydrate later in the process. This method was more common in drier, sunnier climates, so the tanner would acquire his raw material, these stiff, dirty, and preserved hides. He might buy them directly from a butcher or a farmer, or from a merchant who specialized in collecting and selling them. The tannery was a place of business, and the quality of the raw hides directly impacted the quality of the final leather and the tanner's profit. A tanner would inspect the hides carefully, looking for damage from the skinning process, as well as marks from the animal's life, like scars from fences or insect bites. These all affected the final value. The tanner himself was a unique figure in medieval society. His trade was absolutely essential. Without leather, an army couldn't march, a farmer couldn't plow his field, and a scribe couldn't bind his books. Yet, the tanner was often an outcast. The work was physically demanding, but more than that, it was foul. The smells produced by a tannery were legendary. The combination of rotting flesh scraps, animal manure, and harsh chemicals was so powerful that tanneries were legally required to be located on the edge of town and always downstream. The river was the tanner's most important tool in his sewer. He needed vast amounts of water, and the water he discharged was polluted and stinking. So, while his products were used by everyone, from the peasant to the king, the man who made them was often kept at a distance, living and working in a world of his own. His work was a slow, patient, and often disgusting transformation. It started with a stiff, salty skin, and the first step was to turn it back into something soft and pliable, ready for the real work to begin. Before a hide could become leather, it had to be thoroughly cleaned. This wasn't just a simple wash. It was a multi-stage process designed to strip the hide down to its essential structure, the protein network called collagen. Everything else, the hair, the outer layer of skin, the fat, the muscle, and the flesh left over from the butcher had to go. This was the dirtiest, smelliest, and most labor-intensive part of tanning. The first job was to get the preserved hide back to a soft, workable state. If the hide was dried, it was like a piece of wood. If it was salted, it was stiff and greasy. The tanner would take these hides and submerge them in a pit or a stream of running water. This was called soaking. The goal was to rehydrate the skin, washing away the salt, dirt, blood, and grime. This could take a day or two. The water softened the hide, making it flexible again, but it also reactivated the bacteria. The tanner had to watch the process carefully. Too little soaking, and the hide remained stiff. Too much, and it would start to decay. Once the hide was rehydrated, the next step was to remove the hair. This was done using a chemical process called liming. The tanner had a series of pits, often lined with stone or wood, filled with a slurry of lime and water. Lime, or calcium hydroxide, is a strong alkali. It was made by burning limestone or seashells in a kiln and then slaking the resulting quicklime with water. The tanner would submerge the softened hides in these lime pits. The lime solution went to work, chemically attacking the base of the hair follicles and the epidermis, the thin outer layer of skin. It also caused the fibers of the hide to swell up and separate, which was important for the later stages of tanning. The hides would soak in the lime for weeks, sometimes even months. The tanner would have to regularly agitate the pits with a long pole and move the hides around to ensure the lime solution reached every part of the skin evenly. The lime pits had a sharp, unpleasant chemical smell, which mixed with the general odor of the tannery. After soaking in the lime pits, the hair was loose enough to be removed physically. This was hard, manual labor. The tanner, or his apprentice, would pull a heavy, dripping hide from the pit and drape it over a large, curved wooden log called a beaming horse or beam. The worker would then take a tool called a beaming knife. This was a long, dull, curved blade with a handle at each end. Leaning his weight into the hide, he would push the knife down the surface, scraping off the loosened hair and the slimy epidermis in long, matted strips. It was a repetitive, strenuous task that required strength and skill to avoid gouging the hide itself. The scraped-off hair wasn't always wasted. It could be sold to plasterers to use as a binding agent in their plaster. After the hair was gone, the hide was flipped over on the beam, the flesh side now faced up. This side was still covered with a layer of fat, muscle tissue, and connective membranes. To remove this, the worker used a different tool, a fleshing knife. This knife was much sharper than the beaming knife. The process was similar, involving careful scraping and cutting to pare away all the unwanted tissue. This was highly skilled work. One slip with the sharp knife could cut through the hide, ruining it. The goal was a clean, uniform surface, showing only the pure collagen fibers of the dermis. The scraps of flesh and fat were often just thrown away, adding to the general filth around the tannery. At this point, the hide was clean, but it was also full of lime. The alkaline lime had to be neutralized before the tanning could begin. If it wasn't, the finished leather would be hard and brittle. This next step, called deliming or baiting, was perhaps the most disgusting part of the entire process. To neutralize the alkali, the tanners needed a mild acid. They found it in the most unpleasant of places, animal dung. The tanners would create a warm, watery solution of dung and soak the limed hides in it. The preferred type was dog dung, often collected from the streets by children who would sell it to the tannery. Bird droppings, particularly from pigeons or chickens, were also used. This process was called baiting. The dung contained enzymes, specifically proteases, which did two things. First, their acidic nature neutralized the lime. Second, the enzymes broke down some of the remaining unwanted proteins in the hide, leaving the collagen more open and receptive to the tanning agents. This made the final leather softer and more flexible. The hides would be paddled around in this foul-smelling soup until the tanner, using his experience, judged them ready. He might test a hide by pressing it with his thumb. If the thumbprint remained, the hide was sufficiently soft. An alternative to dung was to use a fermented mash of barley or rye. This process was called drenching. The fermenting grain produced acids that also neutralized the lime. While it smelled a little better than a dung pit, it was still a sour, pungent process. After baiting or drenching, the hides were washed one last time in clean water. They were now completely stripped down. They were pale, swollen, and clean, with an open-pored structure. They were no longer a skin, but a prepared pelt, ready for the magic of the tan pits. All the foul, back-breaking work of purification was done. The real transformation was about to begin. With the hide cleaned, de-haired, and fleshed, the crucial stage arrived. The goal now was to turn this unstable, rot-prone material into leather. This meant changing its chemical structure, making it resistant to decay, water, and heat. This process is the tanning itself. In the medieval period, the most common and effective method was vegetable tanning, a slow, patient art that relied on a chemical found in plants. The magic ingredient was tannin. Tannin is a naturally occurring polyphenol that is found in the bark, leaves, and wood of many trees and plants. It's the same substance that gives red wine and strong tea their dry, astringent taste. Tannins have a special ability to bind to the collagen proteins in a hide. When they do, they displace the water molecules within the protein structure and cross-link the fibers. This process makes the hide much more stable. It can no longer be easily broken down by bacteria, so it won't rot. It also becomes stronger and more resistant to water. The primary source of tannin for a medieval tanner was tree bark. The best and most prized was oak bark. Oak tannins produced a strong, durable, and pleasantly colored light brown leather. It was the gold standard, especially for heavy duty items like shoe soles and saddles. But other barks were also used, depending on what was available locally. Willow, birch, chestnut, and fir barks all contain tannins. Each type of bark would give the final leather a slightly different color and character. Preparing the tannins was a job in itself. The bark had to be harvested, usually in the spring when the sap was rising and the bark was easiest to peel from the trees. It was then dried for months to prevent it from molding. Once dry, the brittle bark had to be broken down into a coarse powder. This was done in a bark mill. These mills were often powered by a horse, a donkey, or a water wheel. A large stone wheel would roll in a circular trough, crushing the dried bark into small pieces. The smaller the pieces, the more easily the tannins could be extracted. The tanner would then create his tanning liquor. He would take the ground bark and soak it in water, usually in large vats or pits. The water would slowly leach the tannins out of the bark, creating a brown tea-like solution. The tanner didn't just have one batch of tanning liquor, he had a whole series of them, in varying strengths. This was the key to good tanning. The actual tanning took place in a series of large rectangular pits dug into the ground, often lined with wood planks or stone to keep them from collapsing. These were the tan pits. The process was slow and methodical. A freshly prepared hide, straight from the baiting process, would first go into a week-old tanning solution. This was a liquor that had already been used to tan other hides and had lost much of its potency. This gentle start was important. If a hide was plunged directly into a strong tannin solution, the surface would tan too quickly, a phenomenon called case hardening. The outside would become hard and impenetrable, preventing the tannins from reaching the center of the hide. The leather would be brittle and would rot from the inside out, so the hide started in the weak pits and would stay there for a few weeks. Then the tanner would move them to a slightly stronger pit. This process was repeated over and over, with the hides gradually moving through a sequence of pits, each one containing a progressively stronger concentration of tannins. This was known as the layaway method. In the final, strongest pits, the tanner would lay the hides down flat, alternating each hide with a layer of fresh ground bark. Then he would fill the pit with the strongest liquor and leave it. The amount of time this took was staggering. For a thin skin from a goat or a calf, it might take a few months. For a thick hide from a full-grown ox, intended for the sole of a boot, the process could take a year, and sometimes even 2 years. Throughout this time, the tanner had to manage his pits, moving the hides periodically to ensure an even tan and checking the strength of his liquors. It was a craft based on experience, feel, and sight. There were no chemical test kits. A tanner knew his liquors were ready by their color and taste. He knew a hide was tanned by its feel, its weight, and how it cut. It was a huge investment of time and capital. A tanner would have a fortune tied up in his pits in hides that would not be ready to sell for a very long time. While vegetable tanning was the most common method for producing strong, durable leather, it wasn't the only one. For different kinds of leather, tanners used other techniques. One was tawing. This process used minerals, specifically alum and salt, instead of tannins. The hides were tumbled in a drum with a paste of alum, salt, egg yolk, and flour. This produced a leather that was soft, stretchy, and white. Tawed leather was used for fine goods like gloves and purses. However, it wasn't a true tanning process because the chemical change was reversible. If tawed leather got soaked in water, the alum and salt would wash out, and it would revert to a stiff, raw state. Another method was oil tanning, also known as chamazing. This was used to create chamois leather, which was incredibly soft and absorbent. After the usual preparation, the hide was saturated with an oil, typically cod liver oil. Then, the hide was pounded and worked repeatedly. This mechanical action forced the oil into the fibers of the skin, where it oxidized and bonded with the collagen. The result was a soft, yellowish leather that could absorb a lot of water. It was used for cleaning, polishing, and for making comfortable garments. Each of these methods, vegetable tanning, tawing, and oil tanning, produced a material with unique properties suited for a different purpose. But it was the slow, patient work in the oak bark pits that created the strong, brown leather that was the backbone of medieval life. After a year or more of silent soaking, a hide was finally pulled from the last pit. It was no longer a piece of skin. It was leather, but it wasn't finished yet. It was stiff, dark, and rough. The final steps were needed to make it a beautiful and useful material. Pulling a hide from the final tan pit was a significant moment, but the work was far from over. The object that emerged was technically leather. It was preserved and would not rot. But it was also a heavy, dripping, dark brown slab. It was stiff, uneven in thickness, and had a rough surface. To become the useful material needed by a shoemaker, a saddler, or a bookbinder, it needed to be finished. This complex set of final processes was often the job of a specialized craftsman known as a currier. While a tanner made raw skin into stable leather, a currier made that stable leather into a usable product. The first step after the tan pit was to get rid of the excess water and smooth out the hide. The wet leather was rinsed to remove any loose bits of bark and surface tannins. Then, it was laid over a beam, and a worker would use a tool with a slate or stone blade called a scriber to squeegee out as much water as possible and smooth the grain, which is the outer surface of the hide. Next, the leather needed to be dried, but this had to be done carefully. If it dried too quickly, it would become hard and brittle. The leather was stretched on a large wooden frame, a bit like an artist's canvas stretcher. This was called tendering. The edges of the hide were attached to the frame with toggles or nails. As it dried slowly in the air, the frame kept it flat and prevented it from shrinking and wrinkling. This slow, stretched drying helped to align the fibers in the leather, making it stronger. Once dry, the leather was stiff and hard. It was at this point that the currier's skills became essential. His main job was to make the leather strong, flexible, and water-resistant. The first task was to ensure a uniform thickness. He would lay the hide on a flat stone table and use a special knife, a currier's knife, to shave down the flesh side. This knife had a rectangular blade with a turned edge and handles that allowed for precise control. With skilled strokes, the currier could thin the leather to the exact thickness required for a particular job, whether it was for a thick belt or a thin book cover. The most important part of the currying process was putting oils and fats back into the leather. The tanning process, especially the liming, had stripped out the natural fats from the original skin. Without them, the leather fibers would grind against each other and become brittle. This process was called stuffing or fat liquoring. The currier would create a mixture of fats and oils, known as dubbin. The ingredients varied, but common ones were tallow-rendered beef or mutton fat, cod oil, and beeswax. This warm, greasy mixture was then worked deep into the leather. There were several ways to do this. The currier might coat the leather in the dubbin and leave it in a warm place for the fats to soak in. More often, it was a physical process. He would rub the dubbin into the surface with his hands or with a cloth, working it into the fibers. For thicker leather, he might use a tool to force the grease in. This process made the leather supple and flexible. It also provided a significant degree of water resistance, as the fats filled the microscopic gaps between the collagen fibers, preventing water from getting in. The amount and type of fat used would determine the final character of the leather. A piece of harness leather would be heavily stuffed to make it weatherproof, while leather for a book binding would receive a lighter treatment. The leather could also be colored at this stage. Vegetable tan leather was naturally a shade of brown, but it could be dyed other colors. Black was a common and important color. It was created by treating the leather with an iron salt solution. The iron reacted with the tannins still in the leather, creating a deep, permanent black. This is why old leather sometimes seems to crack and crumble. The iron salts can be corrosive over many centuries. Other colors came from plant-based dyes. Red could be made from the madder root, yellow from weld, and blue from woad. The dyes were applied to the surface of the leather, soaking into the grain. Finally, the currier would finish the surface of the leather. He might polish it by rubbing it vigorously with a smooth stone or a piece of glass to give it a sheen. He might also create a decorative pattern on the surface. This was called graining. The currier would fold the leather over on itself, grain side to grain side, and press it with a board. This would create a network of fine creases on the surface, a pattern that many people found attractive. Different patterns could be made depending on how the leather was boarded. After all these steps, shaving, stuffing, coloring, and finishing, the material was complete. It no longer resembled the raw, bloody hide that had arrived at the tannery months or years before. It was now a finished product, a beautiful, durable, and flexible material ready to be sold. The currier would sell his finished hides to other craftsmen, the cobbler, who would cut it into shoes, the saddler for harnesses, the girdler for belts, and the coffer maker for chests. Each piece of leather, the product of so much time and foul labor, was now ready to play its essential part in the medieval world. The process of making leather was long and complex, but it wasn't just a chemical recipe. It was a human endeavor carried out by real people in a specific kind of place. Understanding the tanner and his world is key to understanding the material he created. Life in a medieval tannery was a world of hard labor, social isolation, and essential economic activity. The tanner's social standing was a paradox. His work was vital. Without him, society would grind to a halt. Armies needed leather for saddles, harnesses, and straps. Farmers needed it for their equipment. Every person needed it for their shoes. Yet despite this importance, the tanner was often looked down upon. The reason was simple: the smell. The combination of decaying organic matter, stale water, lime, and especially the dung used in the baiting pits created a stench that was overwhelming. It clung to the tanner, his clothes, his home, and his entire neighborhood. Because of this, tanneries were almost always segregated from the rest of the town or city. The local laws and ordinances mandated their location. They had to be outside the city walls, or at the very least, on the far downstream edge of town. This was a practical measure. A river or stream was the lifeblood of a tannery. It provided the immense quantities of water needed for soaking and washing hides. It also served as a convenient sewer, carrying away the foul and polluted wastewater from the pits. This meant that anyone living downstream from a tannery had to deal with the consequences. The location was a physical manifestation of the tanner's social position, necessary but separate. The tannery itself was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of open-air pits, sheds, and work areas. The heart of the operation was the yard with its series of pits. There were soaking pits for rehydrating the hides, lime pits for loosening the hair, and the all-important tan pits where the slow transformation into leather took place. These pits were often just holes in the ground, sometimes lined with wood or stone. They were a constant hazard, filled with water or thick slurry. They were easy to fall into, and drowning was a real risk, especially for children or for a worker who might slip on a wet, greasy hide. Around the pits were the work areas. There would be sheds where hides were stored and where the beaming and fleshing took place. The beaming horse was a central piece of equipment. There would be a bark shed for storing the precious oak bark, and a bark mill nearby for grinding it. There would also be frames for stretching and drying the finished leather. The ground was likely to be perpetually muddy and littered with scraps of flesh, clumps of hair, and piles of spent bark. It was a dirty, wet, and physically demanding environment. The work was organized around a hierarchy. The master tanner owned the business. He was a skilled craftsman who had likely served a long apprenticeship himself. He understood the entire process, from judging the quality of a rawhide to knowing exactly when a piece of leather was perfectly tanned. He managed the finances, which was a tricky business. Tanning was a long-term investment. The master tanner had to pay for raw hides, lime, and bark up front, but he wouldn't see a return on that investment for more than a year. This required significant capital. Working under the master were journeymen and apprentices. An apprentice was a young boy who would live with the master tanner and learn the trade from the ground up. His first jobs would be the most unpleasant, collecting dung, cleaning the pits, and doing the heavy lifting. Over years, he would gradually learn the skills of fleshing, beaming, and eventually the secrets of managing the tan liquors. It was a long, hard education. The work was physically brutal, from hauling heavy, wet hides all day to the repetitive strain of scraping. Workers were constantly exposed to the harsh lime, which could cause chemical burns on their hands and arms. There was also the risk of disease. Anthrax, a deadly bacterial infection, could be contracted from infected animal hides. The tools of the trade were simple but specialized. The beaming and fleshing knives were the most common. There were also long poles for agitating the pits and tongs for lifting hides. The courier, who might work in the same complex or have his own separate workshop, had a more refined set of tools: his sharp, two-handled shaving knife, his slickers for smoothing, and his boards for graining. These tools were the tanner's livelihood, and he would have maintained them with care. His tanners were often organized into guilds. These guilds regulated the trade in a town. They set standards for quality, controlled prices, and limited the number of master tanners to prevent too much competition. The guild provided a social and economic support system for its members, but it also reinforced the separation of the tanners from other trades. They were the mystery of tanners, a closed world with its own rules and knowledge, passed down from master to apprentice. In the end, this isolated, smelly, and dangerous world produced one of the most fundamental materials of medieval life. Every strap, every belt, every shoe, and every saddle was the result of this long and arduous process. It was a story of transformation, not just of a raw hide into finished leather, but of foul and decaying matter into a product of strength, durability, and beauty. The tanner may have lived on the edge of town, but his work was right at the heart of his society.